Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. Apologies for just being a few minutes late. Maybe we'll just hold off about half more minute to let folks arrive. All right, well, I think we'll get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Eleanor Gill. I am not a refrigerant specialist, but I became interested in refrigerants and their role in climate change last year after taking a BC Drawdown course on climate solutions. I'm now a volunteer member of the BC Drawdown organization, and we have teamed up with Drawdown Toronto to help bring the Environmental Investigative Agency, or EIA's, crucial work on refrigerant management to Canada. We welcome you to this 1-hour seminar where we're going to discuss the basics of refrigerants and their role in global warming, the Canadian context around refrigerant management, and how we as concerned citizens and consumers across Canada can get involved. A few housekeeping notes. Participants are all muted throughout the whole seminar. If you want to clap or give a thumbs up during the workshop, you can do this by clicking on the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen. We welcome your questions throughout. Please put them in the chat and we'll try to answer as many as we can during the Q&A. For anyone who would like voice to text subtitling, we have those turned on. You can also enable or disable those on your screen using the meeting controls or settings. If anyone needs technical assistance during this presentation, please contact Bjornar Egede in the chat box on your side. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land, the living, breathing, sacred and suffering planet, this being upon whose well-being we are totally dependent and the reason why we're all here. Let's also acknowledge the people who for thousands of years have cared for the lands. We who are settlers recognize the benefits we derive from the dispossession of First Peoples from their lands, those who at first generously welcomed us to their lands. We also recognize that climate change is disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples globally and in Canada in particular. I invite all participants today to acknowledge in writing in the chat box, the nations whose lands they now occupy. I live and work and play in North Vancouver, the unceded lands and waters of the Coast Salish Indigenous peoples and the Squamish Nation in particular. I'm going to invite the other speakers today to say a quick hello before we jump in. So I'd like to invite Avipsa Mahapatra and Catherine Garcia from the EIA to briefly say hi. Oh, there we go. I just got to mute myself. Try again, Avipsa. Sorry about that, everyone.
Not a problem. Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Avipsa. I'm Avipsa Mahapatra. I am the Climate Campaign Lead at Environmental Investigation Agency. And we'll be doing further introductions of ourselves when we come to the right slides, but I also want to call on my colleague, Catherine Garcia, to introduce herself.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Mute buttons, aren't they fun? Welcome to the virtual world. My name is Catherine Garcia. I am the Climate Research Assistant for the Environmental Investigation Agency, and we're very happy to be here today. Yeah, as Vipsa said, we'll get into details later on, but I'll turn it back down to the Drawdown folks. Oh, I do want to also state that I'm on Quiche Nation land today in Southern California. So passing it back to Drawdown.
My camera doesn't want to go on. Okay, here we are. Yeah, it was once again fun with buttons, trying to get onto this screen. My name is David Berman. I am a volunteer core group member of Drawdown Toronto. And I'd like to acknowledge that Tekaronto, as its original Iroquoian name, or Toronto as it's now known, sits on traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and now the Mississauga Anishinaabe, who are the current rights holders of this territory. And this is governed actually by a treaty, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, which stipulates, amongst other things, first of all, it welcomes it's a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee around the Great Lakes region, and it is an agreement to share the land peacefully and in its abundance, in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So other Indigenous nations from all over Turtle Island also call this home and are welcome to this treaty, as well as the newcomers as settlers, as well as our non-human relatives. One of the stipulations of this treaty is that we must only take what we need and leave the rest for the other human and non-human beings with whom we share this land. That includes the insects, the birds, the fish, the whales, the other animals. And this is to ensure abundance for the generations to come. And this is why we're doing this work. So I'm going to move to Drawdown Toronto. If I can get this slide to shift, would be a very good thing. Okay, it doesn't want to shift. Help. There, okay. Right, so here we are. Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And here we're talking about reversing. So it all began with a question. Is it possible to reverse global warming? Is it possible to achieve drawdown, that point when atmospheric greenhouse gases stop increasing and begin to decline on a year-to-year basis? In other words, is it possible to reverse, not mitigate, not slow down, not reduce, but reverse climate change, to change the direction we're going? Because obviously we're heading for a cliff. To answer that question, environmentalist Paul Hawken assembled a team of researchers from around the world who found hundreds of proven existing solutions to reversing climate change and global warming. All of these reported in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The researchers mapped, modeled, and measured these solutions in terms of the gigatons of carbon dioxide, or their equivalents, that were removed or prevented from entering the atmosphere, the cost of implementation, and the return on investment. They did the math. And up to now, they're the only ones to have done so on a global basis. The first report came out in 2017, and the research is robust enough that even after 4 years, it hasn't been seriously challenged. In the meantime, several other reports have been published in the Drawdown.org website, and here we can see the Drawdown Review, and the latest one is farming our way out of the climate crisis, which is around regenerative agriculture, reclaiming degraded land. It's really exciting. So the Drawdown Framework. Are you going to shift? Let's see. There we are. Drawdown Framework is different from most climate change initiatives. I'll go back. Got a little bit excited here. Yes, thank you. Because it's not narrowly focused on carbon. Yes, we have to reduce the sources. We have to bring our emissions to zero. That's an absolute non-starter. Absolute no-brainer, I should have said. But we also have to support sinks, like regenerative farming, like reforestation, like reclamation of degraded land. And we need to improve society. We need to foster equality for all. Even though the actual contribution to greenhouse gases is relatively small, it's vitally important if the other solutions are going to work. Okay, let's go one more. So here we are, a diagram of the relative contributions of the relative sectors to greenhouse gases. So we have 25% coming from electricity production, 24% from food, agriculture, and landfills, and land use, I should say, which includes landfills, and 21% from industry, which includes refrigerants, and 14% for transportation, 6% for buildings, and 10% for other related emissions. So all of this, these arrows go into the atmosphere, this where the accumulation of CO2 equivalents is increasing, but the sinks are relatively small. So the difference between the amount going out of the atmosphere and going into the atmosphere is about 50%. So I'm just going to look a bit, just for a moment, look at the return on investment, because the financial return on investment in the latest iteration of the research is about 500%. So that's that's better than real estate. So anyone who complains that it's not worth it, obviously has never bought a house. And all these solutions are in existence right now. So if we scale them up, we can anticipate a more enjoyable, more equitable, more breathable, greener, happier world. Okay. Now, one thing that's interesting is that drawdown actually happens every year. In the Northern Hemisphere, with photosynthesis, drawdown gases are reduced precipitously. In the winter, they go up again because we're using more fossil fuels. Not only that, but the amount that goes in every year is greater than the amount that gets taken out every year. And so this is why we need to get our emissions down to zero and increase those sinks that can absorb carbon into the soil, into the rocks, into the oceans where they belong. Now, we're focusing particularly on industry today. And if we look at the right-hand column, you can see that, yes, waste is an issue, materials are an issue, but relatively speaking, refrigerants are enormous. And if we look at the next slide, which I'm sure will appear momentarily, you can see the contribution of refrigerants to the climate crisis. Okay, we're going to go back. Yeah, there we are. Okay. So, yes, definitely preventing leaks and switching to alternatives is the way to go. So there's two branches. One of them is managing the refrigerants, which is like preventing the leaks. The other branch is switching to alternatives that are not greenhouse gas emitters. All in all, managing managing refrigerants contributes to 10% of the solutions to global warming. So the calculation is that if we can actually achieve managing and reducing refrigerants the way we need to, we can actually prevent 0.5 degrees Celsius climate change, global warming. That's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1, and we can see some of the climate disasters that are already taking place. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. Let's just make sure that we've got another slide here. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to pass it now on to Avipsa, got it right, who will later introduce us to a deeper dive into the material. Okay, welcome.
Thanks, David. Great. Thanks, David, and thank you also for setting us up with a great introduction. I kill a lot of dinner parties talking about refrigerants and how it impacts climate. Most people don't necessarily make the connection or want to hear about it. So I'm really thankful that you did the basic introduction so I can talk about other fun stuff without boring people too much. Before we go into refrigerants and what we are doing and why we are doing what we are doing, I thought it would be useful to give a brief introduction about who we are. What does the Environmental Investigation Agency do? So we are an international nonprofit organization. We were set up in London back in the 1980s and founded in 1984 by 3 people, one of whom is currently our president, Alan Thornton, who actually lived in Canada, grew up in Canada. So we have a Canadian connection, a very strong Canadian connection at EIA. And what we really do is we investigate and campaign against environmental crime and abuse. And in doing so, we have 3 key campaigns across the organization. One that deals with or focuses on transnational wildlife trade. So you're talking about elephants and tigers and illegal ivory trade in that and how to protect these species through that work. The second campaign focuses on illegal logging and deforestation, particularly for cash crops and timber. So it's protecting the animals, protecting the forest. And then the third campaign is our campaign that I lead and Catherine and I work on, which is protecting our climate with a focus on these super pollutants. And I'll come in a minute and we'll talk more about why we call them super pollutants. But these gases that are, hidden gases in our refrigerators and our air conditioners, but are actually very potent when it comes to their impact on the climate. So that's a little bit about us. Let's see if I can move these slides and talk more about what we will be doing. Okay, so I don't have access to go to the next slide. Thank you, appreciate that. And maybe I'll keep doing that. Okay, I think I see it. Okay, so before I talk more about, how and why we are tackling super pollutants as a global community, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about why are we even calling these refrigerants as super pollutants? So the current generation of refrigerants that is being used in our fridges and our air conditioners, in most of the cooling equipment around the world are hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs. Now, these are the fastest growing greenhouse gases currently in the world. And the reason they are super pollutants is because if you take the same amount of CO2 and you take the same amount of this refrigerant that is HFC, per molecule basis, this is significantly more damaging to the climate than an equivalent amount of CO2. And we are talking about thousands of times higher than CO2. And some of you might recall before even the HFCs were in the picture, there was an effort globally to phase out their precursor gases, which are the CFCs, the gases that were depleting the ozone layer and causing human health effects, including skin cancer by effect. And so what ended up happening is through the Montreal Protocol, while we successfully phased out or ended our reliance on these ozone depleting gases, the CFCs, through the Montreal Protocol, these other gases that replaced them, the HFCs, were okay for the ozone, did not deplete the ozone layer, but were really bad for the climate. So in 2016, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol was signed, where again, the Canadian government had a big role to play in getting the amendment. Of course, the Montreal Protocol itself, has a Canada connection. And now there is a global effort. So globally, all countries were party to that decision. Not all of them have ratified yet, but it is a global agreement to end our reliance on HFCs going forward. Let's see if I can do next slide. No, could I please request for the next slide? Thank you. So there's one before that. So the effort to end our reliance on these gases has two aspects. One is we need to turn the tap off. So what the Kigali Amendment will do, as I mentioned before, is that it's a global agreement to phase down, which is just another word to end, but in steps, production and consumption of these gases. And while that turns off the tap, the next slide, which is about, okay, so we stopped producing new amounts of these gases, but what happens to the gas that is already there in circulation? Next slide, please. And that is where we talk about mopping up the mess. So we not only have to turn off the tap, but we have to mop up the mess. Next slide, please. And this is what David was just explaining, that by even addressing what is already in circulation, we can address as much as 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's not a small number by any means, especially, in a world where we are fighting to save every single, we are trying our best to do everything we can to save emissions or to reduce emissions. So I will not read out this slide, but I would point you to our website to see a lot other information on how the F-gases that exist in our refrigerators, how we can prevent them from leaking, and how we can address them. If we can go to the next slide, please. I can talk a little bit more about what is it that we are talking about when we say, okay, so there's the production that's on factories and they're going to end production under the Kigali Amendment. What happens after that? And this is where a lot of us interface with these refrigerants in our day-to-day life. We cannot control production as a layperson if you're not in the industry. What we can do, however, is think about when we are using cooling in our lives, are we aware whether it has been designed and installed properly? Do we know whether, for example, our air conditioner is leaking? Or when we go into a supermarket and we open the refrigerator, is that leaking HFCs by any chance? We don't know that. A lot of us don't know that information. And that is why we think this work is so important. And going forward, Catherine will even talk about how, because these gases are invisible and people don't know about it as much, you might do all of the effort to save your climate by, taking your tote bag and biking to your local supermarket. And you then open a refrigerator and you take a frozen pizza out, and without you knowing, you might have undone all of the effort that you put in, because that refrigerator is a leaky refrigerator and it's leaking HFCs, which are super pollutants. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and going further in a few slides. But these are points where we are interfacing with these super pollutants. And then of course, what happens, at the end of life? What happens when you're done with your refrigerator? Where does that go? Or what happens when you want to throw your air conditioner out? Where does that happen? And before I hand off to Catherine to talk more about supermarkets, I think one thing I would say is that what often is not known is that, when we go into a supermarket, we think about whether they have organic stuff, whether they are, waste, whether they have vegan stuff, whether they're controlling their waste properly or not. But at least in the US, on average, a single US supermarket could contain as much as 3,500 pounds of HFCs. And it most likely is leaking about 25% of that on an average. So we are talking about a single supermarket causing as many emissions as about, that is more than 300 cars on the road. So this is not a small problem. And that's why supermarkets become so important, especially when you look at their refrigeration systems, which last for 15 to 20 years and become increasingly worse. And with that context, I'll hand over to Catherine to talk about what is it that we've done and what is it that we think we could use your help in doing going forward. Catherine, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Great. Yeah, so as Avipsa mentioned, supermarkets are incredibly leaky systems. In the US context, they leak about 25% of their charge in a given year. And so that's about the equivalent of adding an additional 336 cars on the road per store. So you multiply that by the amount of stores, and that's a lot of emissions pretty much. And so going to the next slide, I'm not sure who has access of this right now. It might be me. What we've done to look into this issue is we did an investigation into US supermarkets to see how much they were leaking and to see if they were leaking. And so what we found is that 60% of Walmart locations and 55% of all other stores that we visited were leaking these greenhouse gases. So we're talking these super pollutants that have 3,000 times the global warming potential of CO2, 1,500 times, it's a range, but all leaking a decent amount in these stores. And we find that these supermarkets are not sticking to their voluntary commitment. Supermarkets like Walmart have made commitments for decades now, saying that they would transition away or properly manage their refrigerants. And we find that that's not the case. And in the US context, it remains perfectly legal to leak HFCs. And that's changing with some regulatory things that are in the works right now, but up to a certain, there's really no limit. And we also have found that current state and local policy does not require servicing when low concentrations of leaks are detected. And we found a majority of small leaks, less than 100 ppm, and in even progressive and ambitious states like California, leak detection devices are not, they don't have to trigger or alarm until a leak reaches over 100 parts per million. And so we were able to find leaks in stores, confirm that this is a real problem, and presented that this year. But luckily, supermarkets can act on this issue. There are many ways that supermarkets can take action, and some of those are listed here. They can, commit to only adopting HFC-free technologies in all new stores. It's very possible and feasible for new stores and new builds to be using alternative technologies. They can begin to replace HFCs with ultra-low global warming potential refrigerants, so retrofitting the stores that exist. It doesn't have to be all at once. It can be a slow process. As the systems reach their end of life, you can slowly introduce something new, or maybe do part of the supermarket display cases at a time. And then they can also manage the refrigerants that they do use by reducing leaks and ensuring that the refrigerants that they use are properly disposed at their end of life and properly managed when they're in the system. Alternatives to HFCs for supermarkets and other applications, including and other refrigeration applications include ammonia, carbon dioxide, and hydrocarbons, all of which are naturally occurring substances with global warming potentials very low or close to zero. Ammonia has a global warming potential of 0. It's naturally occurring. It's used often in industrial chiller applications, from Canadian ice rinks to the large cold storage warehouses of our supermarket chains. Carbon dioxide is the reference gas, as Avipsa said, so it has a global warming potential of 1 compared to the thousands of HFCs. And this is a really popular option for supermarkets. In the US, at least, many are transitioning to transcritical CO2, which is a completely HFC-free system. Others are introducing CO2 slowly with CO2 secondary systems. So you see CO2 in the display cases, but a different refrigerant is helping out elsewhere in the store. And then there's also hydrocarbons, which are a really popular option for plug-in cases. So if you just want to remove your deli cases and introduce different and new deli cases, those can be contained hydrocarbons like propane or isobutane with global warming potentials that are less than 10, but they range like 3 to 6, anywhere in that range, depending on the hydrocarbon. So there's definitely alternatives that exist, and these alternatives come with co-benefits of energy efficiency. And in some places, we are finding that they can be cost competitive with HFCs. And despite this availability and these options being available for supermarkets, we find that many North American commercial users, so supermarkets, are slow to uptake these technologies compared to their European counterparts or even Japanese counterparts. This is in part due to legislation, and ambitious legislation in the EU, the EU F-gas regulation, which has been in process for years now, that has helped transition away from HFCs. And Canada and the United States and other North American countries have similar legislation in process as we speak. But you can see that without that, and with slow and without the shove or without the push or the request, there's limited and slow uptake of alternative refrigeration solutions in Canada and the United States and throughout North America. And this past year, we assessed supermarkets in the US context on their uptake of HFC-free technologies, their refrigerant management, and policy and commitments. So we wanted to know what was happening on the ground right now, how many stores are using HFC-free technology, or what are they planning for? What do they have commitments for? What's their leak rate? Things along these lines. And we scored them based on these key elements of refrigerant management and transitioning. And almost all of the major US food retailers failed. And I know this is a US context and we have many Canadians among us, but some of these companies like Walmart and Costco are international and have implications globally. And so, I turn the question to all of you guys: how does your grocer measure up? This is a question we've started asking communities and various organizations who have come to us, asking how they can take action on this issue. And so we created an initiative to investigate stores, and citizens can go and investigate their own stores. And so we encourage you all to investigate your store and find what's happening in your neighborhood, both good and bad, and help us populate this map as a tool for advocacy in the future. Finding refrigerants is actually pretty easy in supermarkets. All you have to do is look for a refrigerant label. You can see them typically on the inside of a display case. If you open it up, maybe look on the top. The top is a very popular location. Sometimes it's the sides of these cases. And a refrigerant will likely be listed. It'll either say refrigerant 404A, or it'll just say R404A, and then that's a refrigerant, and that refrigerant has a global warming potential associated with it. It also, we can tell from that alone if it's an HFC, if it's not. And so right now we're working on collecting submissions from citizens like yourselves and other groups and people to populate our map with crowdsourced data. And so to submit your supermarket or your grocer, you just have to take a photo, but make sure geotagging is on. That gives us the geographical reference to refer to, and then send it to climatefriendlysupermarkets@eia-global.org. Include the image, the name of the supermarket, and the address of the supermarket, just in case the georeferencing is missing or construed, and we'll populate our map, and you'll see that very soon. And we'll then classify that store in one of these three ways. So it'll either be HFC free or green shell platinum. That's a completely green store. There's no HFCs in it. It's using an alternative solution. But for this one, we really do require company confirmation. So either a company reaches out to us, or we're able to confirm with the company that a store is HFC free, or public record. So some industry publications talk about the Aldi in Rochester, New York, and we're able to deduce that that's this Aldi and it's using transcritical CO2. So that's a green store. Most of the stores that we receive, however, will be labeled as orange or red. Orange is typically a mixture of HFCs or a low global warming potential option. So that's like that CO2 secondary. I'm retrofitting my store. Maybe I'm pulling out some of my cases, adding CO2 or something else in, but I still have HFCs helping elsewhere. Or with many of our crowdsourced data, we can't determine, or it's unknown if it's completely HFC free. We don't want to be marking something as green unless we can confirm that it is. And oftentimes, if you see a CO2 label in the front, it could be that an HFC is elsewhere in the store, because you have to remember there's loads of refrigeration in a store outside of even what we just see in the display cases. It's on the roof, it's in the back rooms, and we can't confirm all of that. And then the red, which is most common in North America, is for supermarkets that only list or use F-gas refrigerants. F-gases are fluorocarbon refrigerants, HFCs, HCFCs, which are those precursor refrigerants that Avipsa mentioned. And these are all of the ones with really high global warming potential and are not great for our climate. And so we encourage you to go investigate your store, share your local store with us in an image, and we'll populate our map very soon. And so I'll pass it on to Eleanor now, and we'll take questions at the end, but off to you, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So I wanted to just give, if we go back a slide, please. We were all supposed to be controlling our own slides, but it's proving more difficult. So Bjornar, can we go back? There we go. I wanted to just give a brief and very high level overview of the refrigerant management context here in Canada. Canada ratified the Kigali Amendment in 2017. We updated our ozone depleting substances and halocarbon alternatives regulation to put our HFC phase down schedule in place starting in 2019. This phase down schedule and program is quite complex, but generally has annual targets and restrictions. So for example, Canada has committed to reducing our high global warming potential refrigerants by 70% by 2030. The regulations and policies in place to support Canada's phase down primarily focus on production and import bans, but also a consumption allowance. A federal task force was established in 2018, the Future Refrigerants Task Team at the Heating, Refrigerant and Air Conditioning Institute of Canada to oversee this phase down. This task team is comprised of manufacturers and contractors and industry associations. There appears to be no representation from consumers or communities at this task force. Provinces are responsible for controlling end-of-life disposal and recovery of refrigerants. Here in BC, we have a very effective disposal program with a 91% capture rate. Our program is an extended producer responsibility program. It's run by MAR, the Major Appliance Recycling Roundtable, and it's paid for by a point of sale fee on our appliances. We have not mapped out all of the disposal programs across the country, but we hope to do so. Under the federal greenhouse gas offset system, advanced refrigeration systems is one of the first 4 priority areas where protocols are currently in development that can pave the way for some carbon offset market projects in the future. So there are commitments and actions at the federal and provincial levels here in Canada around refrigerant management. But we also see opportunities where we as citizens and constituents and voters can help accelerate our performance. There appears to be very little enforcement of leaks and non-compliance with the phase down. There's very little reporting and transparency around non-compliance. Very few fines apparently are issued for non-compliance. There's opportunity for greater awareness within industry about the phase down requirements, potentially funding to incentivize retrofits. There's opportunities for more awareness amongst households and consumers and constituents around disposal options, as well as how to agitate for faster adoption of natural refrigerants. So we can go to the next slide. Leonard, thank you. Next slide, please. So basically, we want to bring the climate-friendly initiative to Canada. There we go. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list of all stores, but our focus is on the big chain supermarkets. And so here's a list of quite a few of them that do roll up into the large conglomerates that own all of our supermarkets here. There are over 15,000 grocery stores across Canada, majority in Ontario, Quebec, and BC. It's an $88 billion industry. Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro have the largest market share. So hopefully you recognize a few here on this map, or on this slide that you shop at. Next slide. So our goal is to get these stores on the map. So with your help, we really would like to populate this map with more dots as our first step in agitating for more action here. The goal is to show a critical mass of data to then spur action. We'd like to have geographic representation to show interest in this topic across the country. And again, our focus is on the big chain supermarkets that have the ability to retrofit and adopt natural refrigerants, not your local corner store. So for those of you part of local or regional organizations here, we're hoping you can maybe organize yourselves to tackle your region. For example, over the last few weeks, members of the Drawdown Newmarket and Aurora organization visited 20 stores in their area, north of Toronto, and already 13 are on the map. So huge shout out to the enthusiastic Drawdown team in Newmarket and Aurora. If you're traveling this summer, it's a great opportunity to gather data from stores you might not normally visit. Next slide. So where will this go once we gather some data from supermarkets? We'll end there. We hope to work in collaboration with our EIA colleagues, who you've met now, to verify and analyze the data we collect. With a critical mass of data, the EIA will be well placed to support us in approaching industry, the companies that own our supermarkets, to ask for more data about their refrigerant use, their plans for retrofits, and their commitments to adopting natural refrigerants. We hope to then better understand what our current corporate practices are, and investigate remaining gaps. We might also want to start investigating leaks at some stores, for example. As constituents, we hope to identify and then lobby for policies and actions that can support faster adoption of natural refrigerants at all levels of government. There could be municipal requirements for new builds, building codes, or maybe incentive programs for retrofits, for example. As we dive into this work and research, we believe there are also opportunities beyond supermarkets for consumer action on refrigerant management, such as ice rinks here in Canada, maybe hospitals, data centers, the entire cold chain, pharmaceuticals. There could be also opportunities for citizens and community groups that could arise from carbon offset market projects for natural refrigerants. This is very much the beginning of a journey. And so we're looking for allies who want to get involved and move this forward with us. We would love to establish an informal citizens group interested in refrigerant management with representation across Canada. So if this topic interests you and you want to stay involved beyond just mapping supermarkets, please reach out to us. We'd love to meet you. And we very much hope to stay in partnership with the EIA, who've got a great track record of action in this area. So I'm going to pass this back to Avipsa to finish with a few more thoughts about our future actions and where this can go. Back to you, Avipsa.
Thanks, Eleanor. I don't have the video on capability yet, so I'll turn it on when I am able to. There I go. Okay. The light situation has gone crazy here as the sun has set. Hope you guys can still see me. Thanks so much. I think you characterized it perfectly when you said that, you know, this is the beginning of a journey, and this is what it is indeed. And while as the Environmental Investigation Agency, we can talk, and I already see some questions coming, so I'm excited to talk more about how we can all investigate our local supermarkets and how, you know, it is a citizen science investigation project. I think it does behoove us to ask the question, you know, what do we do with that data once we collect it, and why are we doing that? Why are we putting these dots on a map? And the real short answer is you can only manage what you measure, right? And without data, it is sometimes difficult to showcase how important and urgent change is in a certain area. So what we have found through examples already is that having this data enables us to go to companies and tell them that, look, people in these regions want your company to do better for climate, and they want you to do it this way. At this point, supermarkets have gotten very, you know, have been able to conveniently hide behind this invisible refrigerant that people don't know about, is too wonky for public, is what they believe. And so, you know, that information sharing or the transparency has been missing from the supermarket sector as a whole about what kind of refrigerant they're using. And this allows us to even go to supermarkets and say, you know, we need you to commit to changing this going forward. And we've done that successfully with some supermarkets, but with several that is yet to be done. And we think this will be super helpful. And just like that, you know, this also becomes a resource. When you look at a map, it also becomes a resource for policymakers at different levels, be it city, be it provinces, be it even at the federal level. For example, we were recently contacted by a city in Florida who saw their map and who were like, wait, they tried to find their local information and they're like, wait, we don't have a single HFC-free store. And now they're considering proposing legislation that would require supermarkets only use reclaimed refrigerant to service their supermarkets. And so these are, you know, examples of how this becomes a tool really in our arsenal to take to industry, to take to government, and amplify this. One other thing I would say is that, you know, as Catherine showed in one of her slides, we have done scorecard for American supermarkets last year, and we are going to do another scorecard to see how the supermarket sector has moved. And we are starting to consider if it makes sense to make the scorecard not just a US based, but also look at the whole North American sector and you know, score these supermarkets so they can see that this is something the public cares about and where they are. I actually still think the American supermarkets will be far behind the Canadian ones, but anyway, that's an idea. We can talk about it more. And finally, you know, this has also helped us to really go to supermarkets and hit them where it hurts most, which is the shareholder. You know, for example, last year, we initiated shareholder actions against Walmart, and we're planning to do that again next year. There are other supermarkets that have been very behind on changing, and we have started talking about shareholder actions for them as well. I'll pause here. I think this, you know, the potential is enormous because having primary data really allows us to take this conversation forward and make our demands very specifically from supermarkets, from industry as a whole, as well as from the government. So I'll pause here, and I see some very interesting questions that I'm having such a tough time not to jump into already. One last thing I will say is that, you know, when you're going to investigate your stores, please, please, please take all safety measures. We will never say do something if you feel unsafe. We you know, during the pandemic, before the vaccines, we even stopped amplifying this action very much because we didn't want people to, you know, even if they're well-intentioned, to go have more sort of physical visits to stores than they need to. So please look up your local stores' rules and regulations. Please utilize common sense and be safe out there. And that's all I'll say. And then I am trying very hard to not answer the citizen question, but I will talk about it when we get to the Q&As. Back to Eleanor.
There we go. Great. Thanks, Vipsa. And I'm not sure if we can go to the next slide where we actually had some of your points up. There we go. This will all be available for folks later. Well, that really wraps up the core of the presentation, so we can move on to Q&A. But before we do so, if for anyone who needs to drop off at 5:30, wherever you are, that's my time, 8:30, please do so. Here is our contact information if you'd like to reach out. We are also going to send around a survey tomorrow, and you can reach out to us through the survey as well. And that will include a link to this presentation on YouTube. So we have a few questions, but and please continue to write them in the chat function. We've got a few minutes for questions, and this is very much an ongoing dialogue. So if we can't get to them all, hopefully the folks who are interested can stay in touch and we can continue to discuss. But Avipsa, maybe right back to you on that citizen versus consumer or community, question. Essentially, is there any kind of issue with using
Sure. Can you guys
project?
Sure. I'm going to turn my video off if the internet is unstable. If you guys can hear me well, if you can show me a thumbs up or something, so I'm just sure that, okay, great. Thanks for this question. This is a really interesting question. And, you know, we've been using citizen investigation as a sort of bucket term for community investigation. And this is a good point, especially as someone, I myself am not a US citizen, I must say. So I'm very grateful for people thinking about these words and how they might impact. The idea here is definitely not to in any way, focus on the person who is investigating. At the end of the day, what we are investigating is whether supermarkets are doing the right thing for the climate or not. And every single individual, every single species, I would say, in fact, right now, but every single human being, no matter where they are, what citizenship they have, who deserve to fight for a better climate. So I don't think this is a literal term. The reason we have used the phrase citizen science is because it is a recognized phrase at least in the US context and in several other contexts that we have been talking to folks where, if it's a project that is being done by sort of non-experts, which policymakers often like to say, that's just a common phrase that has been used. But it's a really good point, and I appreciate you making that point. The real and the right word here definitely is community.
Another question that's come up, and then this is something that I know we at BC Drawdown and Drawdown Toronto have discussed a lot with EIA, is the mechanics of how many photos to take a picture of per store. Do we get worried if we haven't mapped out every refrigerant, if there's many refrigerants, gases in use at a store? And really, I guess, the full instructions on how to submit your data and how to take those pictures and examples of what the labels look like are on EIA's climate-friendly supermarket website. And we've had that link there in the chat a few times. So I really encourage you to look at that. And I think we've often sort of thought that maybe 2 or 3 pictures per store or freezer, fridge cases per store should work. And I guess I'll pass this back to Vipsa and Catherine to comment on, but my sense is that it's not so important to get this totally correct. Stores are often going to be verifying the data, but this is the calling card to the stores to say, look, citizens, we as communities are paying attention to this. We would like you to verify what your refrigerant use and data is. This is what we think it is. And this can often be a great way for stores to advertise their good performance. They might be very happy to share all their new builds that are, CO2 transcritical. So it's really the calling card. I think it's not as important to get this exactly right because the stores will need to verify the data. But maybe Vipsa and Catherine, any thoughts on that?
That's absolutely correct, Eleanor. It's definitely the calling card and the evidence to say, hey, people are interested. Can you confirm? And, it is crowdsourced, so it's okay if we're missing a little bit of something in one location. We obviously don't have all of the US or all of Canada mapped. We're missing that. And that's, why we're doing this. I saw in the chat too, a concern that if I only get one photo and it's CO2, it's going to be marked as green. That's maybe incorrect because there's something else being used elsewhere. And that is why if you do find CO2, and maybe all you find is CO2, we still will not mark it as green unless it is confirmed by the company or there is a public record somewhere in industry publications, or sometimes in the US context, the EPA does create a list. If you're Green Chill Platinum, which is a program within the EPA that is often using HFC-free technology, things like that, that's how you would get a green certification. Otherwise, you'll only be orange. And I know that's thrown some people off who have submitted in the past. They said, it's CO2, why is it orange? And it is to make sure that we're, green certification is like a gold star, right? That's what we're aiming for. So we want to be cautious about who we're giving that to and make sure that we only give it to those that we have confirmed are actually deserving of that title.
Great. And I'll also point out that this map is global. So we're talking very much about the Canadian context. I think we had a participant today from Puerto Rico. Other countries are doing what we're doing, which is trying to spread the word and get folks to populate this to really support and enable EIA to do their good work. So for anyone who's not physically in Canada, that's no problem. It's a global map. And I'm sure you need more data from the US as well.
That's absolutely true. In fact, feel free to share it with your friends, family, networks, anywhere in the world. This is definitely a global map, and you will see more points elsewhere on the globe as well. And you will see some regions have fewer submissions and some have a lot more. But yes, please, thanks, Eleanor, for making that important point.
If I could chime in, I would also say that for those who are not in the Canada context, this is a great guide or template, that can be used elsewhere. It's getting your organization, your locale, your community interested in this issue. And I think the Canadian Drawdown folks in Toronto and BC have done a great job of doing that, organizing this and getting their networks involved. And this is applicable to any location, from a university to a city to a whole country. So
that's great. We are at time. I do see there are a few questions, for example, about heat pumps, and I think that air conditioning is a huge topic to explore, perhaps at a future date. I know with our forest fires happening right now across Canada, everyone is talking about heat pumps that can also cool our homes when it's smoky in the summers, but perhaps we can leave that. I think it's just another example of other applications that have potential for better performance in this area. I'd really like to thank everyone for their time today. We will be sending out that survey along with the link to this presentation. So if you would like to send this to anyone who might be interested, it's a very geeky topic, but we really support or appreciate your support and hope that we can populate this map over the next few months across Canada. So thanks everybody very much.